Okay, the next topic we're going to talk about is probably one of my favorites, the aerial hyperlapse. Now, as I mentioned before, the Mavic 2 Pro has this feature and it is amazing. There really isn't any other drone on the market right now that can do what the Mavic 2 Pro can in terms of hyperlapses. So there's basically two ways to do this. There's a short way and a much longer way. Okay, so the short way, basically what you do, you set your different in and out points and you shoot it, and the drone automatically spits out a 1080 version of that already stabilized and ready to go. Most of the time, this looks pretty decent, and sometimes you can get away with it, but if you really want to squeeze all of that potential out of your drone, you want to keep following along here. To illustrate that point, I'm going to show you one of my favorite hyperlapses that I've shot to date. And I'm going to show you the before, what the Mavic 2 Pro first gave me, and what I ended up with on my own after editing it all the way. Alright, so as you can see, this is a shot of Congress in Austin, Texas. I'm rising up. You can see the traffic going through on the main street there, and it's sunset. It's a good shot, but overall it's pretty dark and pretty dull and not very exciting. Now that same exact shot, edited in Lightroom and then exported, looks like this. Okay, so obviously there's a big difference between the first clip and the second clip. Now, why is that? Well, on the first clip, that's what the drone just spit out. And obviously there's a big punch in, and it does that because it's trying to stabilize it in camera or in the drone, right? So it has to really push in and really crop into the image, and that's why you get such a smaller frame when you have it exported just on the drone. Now if you go back and you edit it on your own, you have a much larger field of view and you have way more flexibility in post. Okay, so let's talk settings for your aerial hyperlapse. Now, you're going to want to go back through and implement all of those topics that I covered in Camera Basics into your aerial hyperlapse, with the exception of a couple. Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so as you can see here, we're in the video mode, and we need to switch over to the photo mode in order to get to a couple settings that we need. Okay, so we're going to lower our shutter speed to 1/4 of a second. We're going to change our aperture to f4 and ISO all the way down to 100. And we're going to change our image format to RAW. Lastly, we're going to want to go through and change our white balance to sunny. And we're good to go for the aerial hyperlapse. Now, I lowered my shutter speed to 1/4 of a second. So why would I do that when this whole time that I've been talking about shutter speed, I've stressed how important it is to be at 1/50th of a second, 1/60th of a second, and so on. So typically, when you're shooting time lapses and obviously aerial hyperlapses, you want the shutter to be open a little bit longer than normal. That way you get motion blur with moving objects. After a bunch of testing, I found that 1/4 of a second is about the sweet spot with shutter speed. And the reason behind that is at 1/4 of a second, you allow some motion blur with cars and clouds, giving a nice fluid motion to those moving objects while keeping the stationary objects nice and sharp. Now again, we're going to implement the use of ND filters when we're doing this. If you're shooting at, say, f4, because that's the sharpest aperture, and your ISO's at 100 and your shutter speed's at 1/4 of a second, your frame is going to be very, very blown out if, in fact, you're shooting during the day. So you always have to make sure that you have an ND filter on. You'll have to play with what strength that you need, but typically I use a 64 ND if I'm shooting hyperlapses during the day. Okay, so once you have your drone up in the air, you have all your settings ready to go, you have to figure out which hyperlapse mode you're going to use. I would highly recommend either waypoints or circle. The other modes, honestly, you're welcome to try out, but I really don't recommend them. I've never had great experience with them. I've never gotten great hyperlapses out of them. Overall, I think just stick to waypoints and circle and you'll be good to go. The best thing about the waypoints mode is you can set your drone to start to create those 3 and 4 axis moves that I talked about earlier in this course. Here's an example of when I did just that. Okay, so as you can see, I'm sliding to the right, I'm rising up in elevation, I'm rotating to the left, and I'm also tilting down to follow the subject, which is the Ferris wheel, all the way through the frame. Now I wish in this shot the Ferris wheel would have been going the whole time, but that's just the nature of the beast. Sometimes these hyperlapses don't work out as perfectly as you would have hoped. When you're setting up your hyperlapses in these different modes, you have to make sure that you're doing a couple things. First and foremost, always make sure that you're shooting in RAW. If you don't know how to do so, refer back. I went through that video earlier in this chapter. Secondly, you want to have your interval set to 2 seconds and not 5. The reason behind that is that the more photos you shoot, the longer your hyperlapse will be, and again, the more flexibility you will have in post. And lastly, you want to crank up your duration to as high as possible. That way you have the most flexibility in post and have the most footage to work with. Now what I'm going to do for you guys is take you step by step the entire editing process of how I shot that one particular hyperlapse in Atlanta. Alright, so let's dive into my computer and we'll take a look. Okay, so here we are on my desktop. This is the example right here, hyperlapse example. I'm going to dive into this. And this is the file structure that I like. You definitely don't have to use this, but if you want to, you're more than welcome. This is, so we have sequence, raw, project, LR is for Lightroom, and finals. So if I double click on raw here, you can see that I've already imported the raw images from this particular hyperlapse into this folder. And so we're gonna go back out, and now everything else is empty. So Lightroom, that's for the LR folder project. I typically use that for Premiere. It has all the autosave files, so I just dump that in there. And then sequence will be the exported JPEGs after we edit it in Lightroom from the raw files. So our next step is to dive into Lightroom. Okay, so here we are in Lightroom. I'm gonna go ahead and create a new catalog. File, new catalog. And I'm gonna go to desktop, hyperlapse example, put it in the Lightroom folder, call it example, and create. Now, as you can see, we have our new file here, or our new catalog called example. We're gonna import all of our raw photos. We're gonna click on import. And we're gonna navigate to here, desktop, where did I put this? Hyperlapse and raw. Here's all of our photos, and we're gonna go ahead and click import. Okay, now all of our raw images are imported. We're gonna go over to the develop module. Okay, so as you can see, it's a 3x2 image. And what you want to do when you're deciding what photo to edit is you want to go towards kind of the best frame of the whole entire clip. So I want to go somewhere in this ballpark. I think that's fine. Okay, so once you have your favorite frame selected, you can go ahead and click on it, which I've already done. Now, if you want to take a look at how you shot it, you can hit I on the keyboard, and you're going to hit it twice. And this will give you the settings of your camera. So, as I mentioned before, 1/4 of a second is perfect. Now, I had to stop down to f2.8 just to try to get as much light as I could, and my ISO was at 200. Now, looking back on this, maybe I could have kicked my aperture up a little bit higher, maybe to 3.2 or 4 or something, and maybe brighten my ISO just a little bit more to get things a little bit sharper, but it is what it is. Okay, so now we're gonna do a quick edit of the photo. I'm not gonna dive in super deep here. You can look up different YouTube videos on how to edit photos specifically, but this is just a kind of a basic guide. I usually start with white balance. Kind of see what I like best here. I think I shot it a little bit warmer, or the final edit was a little bit warmer. I'm definitely not a green fan, so I try to pull that out if I can. Now I always look here at my histogram and try to keep that. I don't want to crush my blacks, and I don't want to go all the way up. I do want to show some of that detail though, so I'll lift these, I'll reset that. If you double click on one of these sliders, it resets. So I might pull the shadows up just to give a little bit more detail overall. Pull these blacks down just to give it a little bit more contrast. See the white, maybe somewhere in there. Highlights, we don't want to go too crazy with the highlights, but maybe we can, maybe actually drop these just a little bit. We're gonna play with contrast, see what we like with contrast. I like just a little bit. This next section, I usually don't play a ton with. It depends on the shot. I usually give it a little bit of dehaze just to clear things up a little bit. Saturation, I'm not liking all of that orange in there, so we'll leave that alone for right now. I usually do a basic kind of S curve with the curve here just to give a little bit more pop. Okay, something like that. Okay, so this HSL section is definitely really important. It's where you can change the hue, saturation, and luminance of your colors in your photos. So it's very important, especially on hyperlapses like this. So if you look up here, we go saturation. This guy right here, that pink, I don't really want that in there. So what I can do is I can click on this kind of dropper, click that, and pull that down. I didn't totally get rid of all of it, but this might. Okay, so obviously that takes it out for the entire image, so we'll get rid of that. Maybe pull these blues down. And now this is kind of where it's up to you on what you want the overall image to look like. I kind of start with the overall kind of a desaturated look and figure out what colors that I really want in there and what level I kind of want them at. Not a whole lot of green in there, so that doesn't really matter. Now that once you click hue, you can go in and change actually the specific color here. So we'll kind of go for like a little bit more of an orange look. Okay, we're not gonna mess with split toning right now. Sharpening is definitely gonna be pretty important here. If we zoom in to, say, one of these buildings, if we're looking at here, this is with no sharpening. That's with all the way up. You want to be careful with sharpening. You don't want to use too much of it. You want to just use, float around here somewhere. And noise. Looks like it's relatively clean, but I'll give it just a little bit of love. Okay, so this is our final shot here. Now, if you want to look at the before and the after, just to compare them, you can hit backslash. And you can see that obviously we took a bunch of color away and we're left with mainly a lot of yellows and oranges, which I like, you may not like, and that's totally fine. Okay, so now we're all done editing this one image. Now, if we go to the right one image, obviously this is the unedited version. So what we have to do is we have to copy and paste those settings of this particular image to all of the other images. So we're gonna click here, we're gonna do Command A, which is select all. We're gonna go over to here and then click sync. We're gonna make sure that all of the adjustments that we selected and added are on there. I didn't add any filters or any transformation, crop, spot removal, so we're good. Click synchronize. And now it's pasting settings. Okay, so now all those settings are pasted and we're ready to export. We're gonna click on a photo, Command A to highlight all of them. We're gonna do Command Shift E to export. and we're gonna tell these where to go. Desktop, hyperlapse, sequence, choose, and okay, example 1, we're gonna put a custom name and sequence starting with 1, and we're gonna go export. Now, depending on how many photos you have taken, this could take a little while, so grab a cup of coffee, hang out, go for a quick walk, and come back. All right, so all the photos are done exporting, and we're gonna go into here, look at the sequence. Everything's in there. Now, this is really important. Make sure that when you export these, you number them correctly. I numbered them initially when I was exporting them, but let's do it one more time just to double check. Well, again, we'll do Command A to select these guys, and we'll do rename. We'll do example here, start with numbers, rename. Now we're gonna open up Premiere and import these photos, make it a clip, and take a look at what we have here. Okay, so here we are in Premiere. We're gonna open a new project, and we're gonna put this in desktop, hyperlapse example, project, yep. Example again. Okay, so here we are in Premiere. We're gonna click down here in the bottom left, Command I for import, and we're gonna go into our sequence folder, and we're gonna put this to number 1. We're gonna select the very first frame, select options, make sure this checkbox is checked, image sequence. If that's not checked, make sure that's checked, it's very important. Click options again, click the first one, and now click import. So now we have this, it says it's a JPEG, but this is actually a clip. We're gonna create a new sequence. This is gonna be a 4K sequence, 4K at 24p. Again, example. Say yes, click and drag here. We're gonna keep the existing settings. And now you can see that this is our hyperlapse. So we click play here. That's what we currently have. Pretty orange. We can maybe change that later, but again, this is just an example. Now, if we go over to effects, click on this again. Now, because this was shot in RAW, we have a little bit of room to play with. So 69 as opposed to 100 gives us a little bit wider frame. And this is what I was talking about before. If you shoot this and you export it just from the drone, you're not gonna get this wide of field of view. Also, because we have the flexibility of that larger image, we can also adjust here vertically up and down if we want to. We'll say leave it there, hit play. I think it looks pretty good overall. Now it's definitely a little bumpy, so we're gonna give it a little love with warp stabilizer. Go to effects. And I have a favorites folder set up here, but if you don't, you can go to warp stabilizer, drop this in. And I usually take this subspace warp off and I leave it just to crop. And what that does is it takes away some of the gel effect. I don't know if you guys have seen that or had any experience with that, but if you add too much of the auto scale and the smooth motion overall, it really kind of warps the image and you get that weird jelly effect. So I usually just leave it to position, scale, and rotation and stabilize and crop. It's going to still stabilize it, but it's gonna punch in just a little bit. At that point, you can do the same. You can punch in, make sure that your frame's good, and then you can export. Now, depending on how long your hyperlapse is, sometimes this can take a little bit to actually stabilize. So again, give it a little bit, depending on your computer, etc. Give it a little bit and come back here in a few minutes. Okay, so we're all stabilized now. We're gonna go ahead and play. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Okay, now as you can see, we do have these black bars on the side. That's what I was talking about. It does punch in just a little bit. So we're gonna knock this up to, we'll say 71. And we're ready to export. We're gonna hit I, use the down arrow to go to the end of the clip, the left arrow to just go one frame in, and now hit O, and click in here. Now hit Command M to export. And we're gonna tell it where to go by clicking here. And now we're gonna go into our desktop folder here and final, and we'll say final hyperlapse. Save. Now, as you can see here, this is very important. It's exporting at 3840 by 2160. That's great. All these other settings are pretty good. The most important setting that you want to take a look at is your bit rate. Whenever I'm exporting 4K footage, I always go VBR 2-pass and bump up the target bitrate to 40 and the maximum bitrate to 70. Okay, H.264, everything else should be good. Audio, don't need audio. Okay, should be good to go, and we're gonna click export. Okay, so we finally made it. We have our export and we're all done. I know it's a lengthy process, but you can't compare the version that you get from the drone and what you can get by doing it manually. So I hope this helps you guys, and I'll see you in the next movie.